I have the privilege today to introduce our speaker for the presentation, Peer Crowds, a new approach to reaching youth and communities with behavioral health issues. Our presenter today is Jeffrey Jordan, and I'll give you an introduction. Jeffrey Jordan is the President and Executive Creative Director of Rescue Social Change Group. Social change is Jeff's priority, evident in all his endeavors, from his academic research to his leadership at Rescue SCG. His passion for social change began in high school when he volunteered for an anti-tobacco group. Observing the lack of effective social marketing services, he started Rescue Social Change Group in 2001 when he was only 17. While growing Rescue SCG, Jeff studied marketing for his undergraduate degree and received a master's in experimental psychology from the University of California, San Diego. As the founder of a strategy called social branding, Jeff focuses on the relationship between identity and behavior to change behavior, through culture. Jeff believes the empirically measured outcomes of social branding programs and other innovative Rescue SCG strategies will lead to a new era of prevention and behavior change that is focused on culture and its powerful role in each of our lives. I actually met Jeff several years ago at a national tobacco control conference, and it was really kind of interesting because I was going to the normal workshops on various issues like clean indoor air and taxation and youth advocacy, and then I go into this one workshop that was completely different than anything I had ever seen, and the only words I could use for it was just incredibly creative and innovative. And Jeff was young at that time. I'm not sure how old he is now, but I was quite impressed, and that was many years ago, and I know over the years they've been expanding their approach to other issues, particularly ones that SAMHSA is interested in, like behavioral health. I was asked to talk a little bit about SAMHSA's role in tobacco. I don't want to really get into it too much because I'd really like to hear more about what Jeff has been up to, but clearly at SAMHSA we're interested in tobacco as a substance use disorder or problem. We do, obviously we implement the Sign-On Amendment to reduce access to tobacco products, but we also have a major concern about tobacco use by people who have mental and substance use disorders. This population, this group makes up 25% of the population of this country, yet they account for 40% of all the cigarettes smoked. So it's a major concern. Without delaying any further, I want to welcome Jeff, and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone here and everyone on the phone for joining me. It's a pleasure to be here to be sharing some of these crazy, wacky ideas with you. But hopefully, after today, as we are preparing for National Prevention Week, you walk away with some new ideas, some new approaches, new ways to think about the work that you do from some of the examples and ideas that we have to share today. And so for those tech-savvy ones of you in the audience and on the phone, here's some tweeting information for that live tweeting that I know you guys can't resist doing. You heard a little bit about where I come from and my organization, which is Rescue Social Change Group. We've been around for about 13 years, and we are focused on all sorts of positive behavior change. So the only things that, even though we are a marketing company, we exclusively work on positive social change. So all the services we provide are just like a marketing company, everything from conducting research to creating commercials to hosting events and things like that, but it's only for positive social change. And about 95% of our clients are actually government agencies. And the behaviors that we have the most experience with are tobacco control, encouraging physical activity and healthy eating, violence prevention, and alcohol use. There's about 75 of us now spread around the US. And one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is that we are a science-driven organization. So we have a number of PhDs that are on our staff. We conduct research both in partnership with universities as well as our own research for our clients. And we want to make sure that everything that we're doing is proven. It's not just an idea that came up in a creative session and that we just ran with it. And that's actually forced us to continue to reevaluate our approach and tweak things as we go, and that's exactly what we want to happen, right? We're under no delusion that the first idea was the perfect one. And it's this science-based approach that has really helped us continue to evolve that. And we're located nearby in DC as well as in San Diego and Vegas and Albuquerque. And I come from the San Diego office, and Wayne is here, who is stationed at our DC office. And just to give you a quick breadth of where our work is, you can see that our primary clients are actually state health departments. So we work with a number of different state health departments on their, it's mostly tobacco control, and then also other behaviors that, such as violence, obesity, and nutrition and things like that. And then also about a year and a half ago, we were selected as one of the FDA's prime contractors for their national tobacco control work, and we're responsible for the multicultural and LGBT youth tobacco control programs that will be coming out in the future. So what I want to talk about today, obviously, is changing youth behaviors. But I want to narrow down to talk about a specific kind of youth behavior change. So even though we do work in all sorts of different behavior change, the kind that I want to talk about today is what we call culture change. So there's at least 3 different paths to change behavior. And I know you're familiar with at least 2 of these, which is knowledge change, which is the idea of simply health education, that if we educate the public about a specific health issue, they will choose to change their behavior. And then the second kind, which is policy change, that if we make it harder to engage in a risk behavior or easier to engage in a healthy behavior, that we will stimulate behavior change. So those are both excellent strategies that both cause change in different environments. And we do work in both of these areas, and we love them dearly. But I'm going to talk about a third area, which is what we call culture change. And so culture change is what we can do when kind of neither of these are working as effectively as they used to. So let's say that we start out with a specific behavior such as tobacco control, and first we educate everybody about the harms of tobacco use, and a number of people choose to stop smoking because of that, but some people continue to smoke. So then we say, okay, well, let's do some policy change. Let's raise the price, let's do clean indoor air, let's do all of these different things. More people quit smoking, but then we still have groups of youth and adults that are continuing to smoke. We have a good policy environment, we have a well-educated audience, and they're still smoking. What happens then? Do we just kind of redouble our efforts in education and in policy, or do we look at possibly additional strategies to add on for that kind of hardcore final group that won't change? And that's what we look at, is saying that, well, maybe for that final group, there's something else going on that policy and education alone won't be able to address. And that's when culture change may come in. Changing the idea of what it means to use tobacco, what it means to initiate tobacco use, what it means for people to see you smoking, what it makes you feel like, all of those different things. And so in order to really address culture change, we first have to kind of do a little bit of behavior change of our own. Because looking at culture requires us to look at behaviors very differently than we're accustomed to looking at them in the government. And so what does that mean is that we actually have to flip our perspective. Rather than looking at the health behavior from our own perspective of why we think it's wrong, what is the science that we have, what are the reasons that we think people should stop engaging in a risk behavior, we have to look at it from the perspective of our audience, whether that's youth or young adults or adults. We have to understand what does the behavior mean from their perspective? What is the good reason that they have for engaging in this behavior? I know it's hard to think about that as a public health advocate, to think that there is a good reason, but for a 14-year-old who's binge drinking for the first time or smoking for the first time, engaging in violence, there is a good reason that they decided to engage in that behavior. It might not be a good reason to you, but to that person, it was a good reason. And if we understand what that reason was, we are in a better position to be able to change it. We have to understand who their influencers and their stakeholders are. So a lot of times we enter communities and we say, well, who else is doing public health? Those are our potential partners. We're going to build a coalition with them, and this is how we're going to cause change. But do those partners actually touch the lives of this specific kind of teenager that you're trying to reach? Who are the people that are involved in this person's lives and what influences them? Instead of looking at it from our perspective. Looking at their values and their interests rather than our values and our interests. The communication channels that they listen to and they watch rather than the ones that we think they should. The languages that they use, and not just language like Spanish versus English, but slang terms and things like that. And also the social groups and the way that they see their social structure and what it means to them. So this is very, as you'll see, it really causes a lot of things to kind of be flipped on their head, because we often approach public health as, here are the reasons why this behavior is bad. Let me tell you about them, and hopefully you will agree with me. without necessarily knowing what were the reasons that they chose to engage in that behavior in the first place. And that's really where the key lies, is if we understand what's good about it to them, we can offer that same goodness with the health behavior. And one of the factors that we've noticed that is really, really influential in this process of understanding why youth engage in risk behaviors is this concept of peer crowds. So peer crowds is not a term that we came up with, but is one that we proudly use throughout our campaigns. And there's a few different definitions in the literature, but the definition that we use is the macro level connections between peer groups with similar interests, lifestyles, influencers, and habits. So while a teen has a local peer group that he or she socializes with, that teen and his or her peer group both belong to a larger peer crowd that shares significant cultural similarities across geographic areas. So why are peer crowds important? It's because, if you think about a high school here in Maryland, and you'll find that, in the lunchroom you might have a group of goth teenagers who, it's like 5 of them, they're all dressed in black, and they listen to a certain kind of music, and all of the other kids think they're weird, and etc. Fly all the way to Oklahoma City, or to Salt Lake City, or to Los Angeles, go to a high school there, you're gonna find another group of teens dressed almost exactly the same way, that listen to almost the exact same bands, who go to the exact same websites, but have never met the group of goth teens here in Maryland, right? So the question is, how is it possible that this social group, this peer group here in Maryland, and one in Oklahoma City, and one in Salt Lake, and one in Los Angeles, that they all have the exact same cultural interests, and dress, and fashion brands, and bands, and all of this is exactly the same? How is that possible? Well, it's possible because of peer crowds. Because today, youth aren't simply creating their own cultures where they live. They're being influenced by mass media, they're being influenced by the internet that is global, and they're adopting these interests from that same global source. And so what's happening is that we're actually seeing a lot of similarities across the cultures that youth adopt in different areas. Now, there's unfortunately one group that has fully understood this for a long time, and that's the tobacco industry. And there's other industries that have understood this for a long time too, but the tobacco industry is one in particular that knows how to do this very well. Because what they realized decades and decades ago is they said, okay, we have this one product to sell, right? We have this one stick of tobacco. And we want to reach all of these different kinds of people. Now what we could do is we could create this one massive brand, and we can try and convince everyone we can to use this product with this one brand. Or we could create different brands for the exact same product to reach different groups of people. And so what this same company did, a company like Philip Morris, said, okay, we're one company, but we're going to sell this pretty much exactly the same product under all of these different brands to reach all of these different groups of people. Because what they realized is that there's no such thing as one type of person in a country or in the world. We're all different from each other, but there are groups of people that they can target effectively, and that if they segment that audience a little bit by who they are, by their psychographics, and we're not talking about gender or age or race, we're talking about what interests they have, what their culture is, that if we can segment them in those ways, we can actually reach them much more effectively. You have, R.J. Reynolds here that has multiple brands that reach young people, unfortunately. But what they realized is that they can more effectively convince people to start smoking by having these different brands that have different associations than by having one massive brand to try and reach everybody. And so what does that mean in practice is we see a brand like Marlboro, and everybody knows what it means. It means being manly, being country, being all of these different things. And people who smoke that brand, they might not be a cowboy, but they feel a little bit cowboy when they do it, right? And that's the whole point. The whole point of branding is to give you more than just the utility of the product that someone's selling you. They want you to feel a certain way when you get that product. Not just that I'm addicted and I'm going to smoke this cigarette, but that I feel a certain way thanks to this cigarette. And the other brands are, Cool, that gives you more of a hip-hop sense, and that has worked very hard to establish that hip-hop brand. And then we have Camel, that's really focused more on the alternative side. So what the tobacco industry figured out is that there are different groups of people. You don't have to have a different brand for every individual person, but if you can kind of reach some of the major groups that exist, and there's not that many, thanks to the internet, thanks to mass media, we're not quite that different, but we're different enough to require a few different strategies. And that if we can create a brand for each of those, we're going to be much more successful, and it's worth the investment in the additional brands and the cost of new packaging and new marketing and all of these things. That it's all worth it because they will convince more people to start smoking thanks to the tailoring that they've done with their brands to the lifestyles of these people. Now, I just gave you a very commercial example, but before we get too far, I do have to put a disclaimer, which is that actually most commercial marketing doesn't do this quite as effectively as the tobacco industry does. The tobacco industry is actually better marketers than a lot of other industries, unfortunately. And so if you look at something more common, like Pepsi and Coke, they're not necessarily using peer crowd strategies. They're using more of a general audience, try and reach everyone I can kind of strategy. And that's because they're not necessarily in the business of convincing people to start drinking soda. There are already enough people drinking soda for them, so all they do is they fight with each other for those customers, right? So they're in the business of convincing a brown soda drinker to drink a different brand of brown soda. They're not in the business of converting a water drinker into a soda drinker, a juice drinker into a soda drinker. In fact, they have products to sell to all of those varieties, right? And so that is very different. And that's something, we call that brand preference change versus behavior change. And it's important to recognize this distinction because as, all of us who are involved in communications, when we go home and we're watching TV or we're looking at a magazine and an advertisement stands out to us, we're always like, oh, is there a way I could use this, in my work? And how can this influence my work? And that's always kind of top of mind for us. And a lot of those strategies, unfortunately, are what we call brand preference change. So now the difference between these is that brand preference change is primarily concerned with awareness, memorability, and likability. Why? Because I don't have to convince you to start drinking soda. I just need you to like me more the next time you go to the 7-Eleven and be aware of my brand, remember my brand more than the other guy, and like my brand more than the other guy. And if you do that, you will buy my soda if you buy soda. Now, you could buy water and like my brand and be aware of my brand, but never buy it, right? So I could say, hey, I think Coke is a great brand. I don't drink Coke because I drink water, but I still could like Coke. And Coke's okay with that because Coke says, well, it's selling water and that's fine. But for us, we're not okay with that, right? We can't have hundreds of thousands of youth around the country saying they like our campaign, but then smoking cigarettes or drinking or engaging in violence or whatever it is the behavior. We actually need to go one step further. We need to convince someone who is not engaged in that behavior to engage in that behavior. So that would be like Coke trying to convince organic juice drinkers to start drinking soda, right? Now you say that in the Coke boardroom and they'll say you're crazy. You should not do that. You should not waste our money trying to do that. But we are trying to do that every time we try to reach a truly high-risk population. That's what we're trying to do. And that's why what we have to do is so much more complicated than what most commercial advertising does, okay? So when we're looking at behavior change, what we're looking at is more persuasiveness, relevance, and identification. We need people to say, that story that's coming on there, that's my story. Those values that are being presented, those are my values. I identify with that, it's relevant to me, and that is a new perspective I need to consider, a new piece of information I need to consider, a new, whatever it is, it's something that is relevant to my life that I need to consider. So I'm going to go even one step further and say that actually mass awareness, which is so critical in the commercial world, is not critical for you. And that will probably be the most radical statement I say today, but here's why, and I'm going to have a little friend explain it.
Both those belts look exactly the same to me, I'm still learning about this stuff and,
This stuff? Oh, okay, I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. But what you don't know is that that sweater is not just blue, it's not turquoise, it's not lapis, it's actually cerulean. And you're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns. And then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets? I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
What she was explaining was that that color was influenced by this group, but the recipient of that influence had no idea that that's where the influence came from, right? So, and we know, we can say that that's how fashion works, and that's pretty easy to understand. Now let's think about that from a commercial versus behavior change perspective. So let's say in the commercial world, right, I'm trying to sell you, we'll go back to Pepsi, I'm trying to sell you Pepsi. In order for you to buy Pepsi, in order for my marketing campaign to be successful, you must know the name of my brand. Because if you don't know what it's called, if you don't know what Pepsi is, how can you buy it, right? Now, let's skip over to behavior change. Let's say that I have some campaign called, the Awesome Anti-Smoking Campaign. And I convince these 10 really influential kids not to smoke through my Awesome Anti-Smoking Campaign. And those 10 know all about my campaign. But then because those 10 are so influential, another 90 youth, right, are influenced by those 10 and choose not to smoke. Those 90 youth never heard of the Awesome Anti-Smoking Campaign, but they chose not to smoke. So now we have 100 people that were affected by your campaign, but only 10% awareness amongst that 100. Does that mean that we were a failure, even though we had 100% of them change their behavior? No, right? That's exactly what we would love to happen. Now the difference here, why is that different? Why does that work for us and not work for the commercial world? Because our product is a behavior. And a behavior doesn't need our brand name, our campaign name to spread. The behavior will spread by itself if the right people engage in that behavior and are proud to engage in that behavior. Compared to the commercial world where they need to see the product, right? So that's kind of this radical idea. Wait, I don't need to spend, $500 million to try and make sure everyone is aware of my brand. What I have to do is spend the right money to convince the right people to be aware of my brand. And if I convince them to change, it will spread. It will spread from them, and the others might not be aware of my brand, but they'll see the change. And that's really something that the tobacco industry, either purposely or inadvertently, knows to do as a collective. So what the tobacco industry does is by, when they were sponsoring movies, when they were, hopefully they're not anymore, but we think they're not. But when they were sponsoring movies, when they were really out there going full steam ahead with their marketing, they weren't just investing in promoting their brand. They were investing in promoting smoking. Because they knew that it would benefit them, no matter which brand they took. The more people that smoked, the better for their brand. And so that's kind of a different way to think about it, that it goes beyond what our commercial partners usually know to do. And something that we can truly learn from the industry, not just for how to prevent tobacco use, but to how to prevent all these other behaviors that we're working on. And so here's a quote from one of the tobacco industry documents that I think really shows how well they understand this. This was Operation Green Apple, which was the introduction of Salem cigarettes to New York City. And they said the field representatives will be recruited from within the local scene, thus they will acquire the respect and trust of these trendsetters. They will speak their language, dress their dress, and walk their walk. Once our relationship is solidified with the nightclub owners, management, and staff, we will begin to subtly train the employees on how to influence smokers. So this is a subversive strategy of associating a behavior with a type of person, with a type of identity that someone wants to achieve. And it's through that association that they know that if they can get that cool bartender to start smoking, the others will start smoking. Doesn't matter if they saw an ad from them, doesn't matter if they got some free swag from them, all it matters is that that cool, influential person was smoking. So, what the tobacco industry understands is that who you are motivates behavior more powerfully than what you know. Because who you are determines who you look up to and what behaviors you are interested in emulating. And so what does that mean is that when we think of behavior, it's often an equation, right? We have our motivations and our costs. And when we think of things like health education, we think of policy change, we're thinking about either increasing that motivation or decreasing it, or increasing that cost or decreasing it by making a behavior more expensive to engage in, by making a healthy behavior easier to engage in. We're playing with those knobs to try and cause change, and that's how behavior change is caused. But what we often don't realize is that there's a whole nother side to that equation that we can also play with. we're not just limited to the utilitarian side of behavior, we can also affect the, what we call identitarian side of behavior. And so the identitarian side of behavior has to do with who people think engage in these behaviors. So a 14-year-old out there, who do they think smokes and who do they think doesn't smoke? And that, depending on who they see themselves as, will determine how much value there is in tobacco use and how much there isn't. So we often talk about like, oh, if we could just make cigarettes $10 a pack in the whole country, people would just stop smoking. Well, maybe. There's people who buy $1,000 purses. There's kids who buy sneakers that are worth $250 because they think they're cool. If people think that smoking is cool enough, can we really outprice coolness? Or are we simply just going to keep kind of chipping away at it? Well, what if we could just make them not cool? Take away that value. Then that high price that we might already have in our community at $7 or $8 might be enough to dissuade people. So the first thing we got to do to get to that point is we have to realize that demographics might not be the be-all, end-all of data, all right? So demographics, which is often how we choose to separate our audiences, was actually, the last time it was relevant was when our audience was born. Because the day our audience was born, that was the only day that they were solely defined by their gender, ethnicity, and background. Ever since then, they've been making choices. Choices that have defined their identity, their interests, their habits, their lifestyles. And if we're looking at a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old, we're looking at data that's 15 or 20 years old if all we have about them is demographics. Because just because you're a black female or a Hispanic male doesn't mean you've made the same life choices and have the same values and think the same way and act the same way from those demographic choices, or from those demographic realities. So what we want to know is, what are your choices? What are your interests? Who are you today? And we want to use that information to change you. And so to do that, we have to first understand how it is that identity and behavior come together. And so this slide kind of sums up entire textbooks of psychology and social psychology, so I apologize for that. But to get through it very quickly, the idea is that each of us have a multidimensional identity. We look up to others who are achieving that identity more successfully than we are. We learn from those. Once we see a big enough pattern, we then form an association. And that association will manifest as desire if we desire that identity, right? So every teenager has associated certain behaviors with being rebellious. But it's only the ones who want to be rebellious themselves who then that association manifests as desire. And so what we have to understand is, well, what is being associated with alcohol, with violence, with tobacco, so that we can start to break that association. Because if we understand what it means to engage in those behaviors, then we can try to understand how to undo that. And so the first way to do that is we have to segment our audience based on their identity. And so segmentation is a commercial marketing technique known as the process of classifying a market into distinct segments that behave in similar ways or have similar needs. One of the very interesting parts of tobacco industry documents is all the different ways they've segmented people over the years, all the crazy things that they call different people. But one thing that you'll notice is that demographics are largely absent from those segmentations. They're all psychographic. They're all explaining who they are, how they feel about how much they're willing to pay for things, how they act, what tobacco could mean to them, what their family means to them, are they independent, are they, all these psychographic variables are how they group their audience and how then they choose which brand they're going to promote to that group. And so for us, particularly when we're talking about teenagers, one of the most salient factors that we haven't been able to really tap into in a systematic way is peer crowds, which we defined earlier. And so the way that we measure peer crowds is through this process we call FOSSI. And this is our approach to pretty much to formative research and to community assessment, but to an assessment from our youth's perspective, right? So we're used to assessments that have to do with the entire community. What are all the stakeholders? What's everyone involved? But we want to know, well, what is the world from a 15-year-old's perspective who's using tobacco? And that's what this research is designed to do. And so it uses pictures. And the reasons that we use pictures are because pictures tell us exactly what kind of a person it is that we are trying to go after. And so what the pictures do is they allow us to group people without the negative consequences of words. So words mean something different to everybody. And we started out doing this research with words. We tried with, calling groups of people different things, and we knew they were talking about the same thing, but they were using a completely different word, and it was like, okay, this is never gonna work. So then we moved on to pictures, and we asked you to group pictures based on who they think hang out with each other. They form groups. We do that with dozens and dozens of teenagers. We are then able to put those associations into a statistical analysis. It's this crazy social network analysis of the images that is conducted by people smarter than I am. And then we end up with these peer crowds. And these peer crowds are defined, we give them names based on what youth are saying in the groups, but they are defined by their, but they're defined by the pictures, and we never use these names with the youth. And so then we're able to put those same pictures in surveys. And when we put those pictures in surveys, we are actually able to measure how much youth in a certain community are influenced by that specific peer crowd. And so here's an example of a mock community, and all these different peer crowds from hip hop, preppy, mainstream, alternative, hip hop, etc. And so we see that preppy and mainstream are some of the biggest groups, and we see that everywhere around the country. Those are some of the biggest peer crowds in the US, and that's why that's usually what comes to mind when we think of teenagers, is often a preppy or mainstream teenager, but there's also all these other groups that are important too. Now the nice thing about this is that since we're able to measure it in a quantitative fashion, we're then also able to measure risk behavior. And so when we measure risk behavior, here's an example of tobacco use, we see that there's some major differences in who uses tobacco today and who doesn't. And this is what we commonly see. We commonly see that mainstream and preppy teens are at low risk of using tobacco, and we see that alternative, hip-hop, country teens are at high risk of using tobacco. Now, I want you to think about all of the anti-smoking commercials you've ever seen in your career. Who do you think is usually depicted in those commercials? Who are those commercials usually designed around? Which one of these groups do you think?
Preppy and mainstream.
Preppy and mainstream, right? And so preppy and mainstream are kind of the biggest groups. And so if you were trying to sell something and you're like, I want to sell it to the most number of people possible, preppy and mainstream make sense because they're the largest number of teens out there. But if you're specifically looking at a risk behavior, well, we got to look at it like cultural epidemiologists, all right? We want to say, where is this disease of smoking concentrated? And where can we go in and tackle it in a strategic way so that it stops spreading to these other groups? And what you'll find in community after community is that the groups that are most likely to use tobacco are alternative and hip hop and country teens. Teens who are actually specifically trying not to be preppy. So when they see a commercial full of preppy kids saying don't smoke, they're like, yes, I'm doing the right thing by smoking because I don't want to be anything like that kid. And so to do this, we have to first kind of really understand what peer crowds are, how they differ across the country. And so these are some of the most common peer crowds that we've found as we've done hundreds of studies like this in about 30 or 40 different states. And what we found is that mainstream and preppy is always the biggest, but we often see things like hip hop, country, and alternative, and occasionally we're starting to see reggaeton pop up. And LGBT has its own kind of place here that's a little different because of coming out and things like that kind of make it different than the others. But, so mainstream teens are sometimes the favorite teens because these teens, what defines them is that they're not defined by their social group. They're defined by something else, like wanting to go to college or wanting to be a good student or things like that. The next group that we have is preppy teens. They look similar to mainstream teens, but what's different is that their main priority is actually being cool and being social, and so they'll dress in more, they'll be more concerned about the way they dress. They listen to top 40 music, so these kids do listen to hip hop and they do listen to rock, but it's from top 40. It's not that that's their favorite kind of music. So when we say, I'm about to talk about hip hop, we're not talking about the hip hop these kids listen to, we're talking about, I guess, real hip hop. So the hip hop peer crowd, listens to more real hip hop. They often come from a place of kind of more tougher lifestyle, more having to overcome more adversity, and that actually ends up connecting them more with hip hop culture and the lyrics of hip hop music because a lot of the people who sing in hip hop come from those same backgrounds, and that forms an association. And then another group that we have here is alternative. And so alternative is also kind of has a similar approach where it is adversity, but it's a different kind of adversity. And a lot of rock musicians talk about that, and they talk about them growing up and what that was like, and being different and not fitting in, and teens identify with those things. So one of the pieces that I often hear in prevention is, well, my city, my town, my state, my community is different than everyone else's, right? Totally unique. And we need our own campaign because we're completely different. You are different, and we would never say that you're not, but here's how communities are different. What it means to be hip-hop is pretty much the same in the entire country. It's actually the same in other countries as well. These are global cultures that we're talking about. But what makes one community different than the other is the makeup of the peer crowds. How big some peer crowds are and how small others are. So here's just mock data of our estimate of what Oklahoma City and Los Angeles look like. That in Oklahoma City you'll have much smaller alternative and hip-hop peer crowds. They're present, but they're small. And then you go to Los Angeles, you'll have a much bigger hip-hop peer crowd, a bigger alternative peer crowd, and a very small country peer crowd. So the cities, if you just grab 5 random teens from Oklahoma and 5 random teens from Los Angeles, they'll look very different. But in reality, if you ask them, well, what's your peer crowd? And you start to match the peer crowds together, you'll be like, oh, if they're from the same peer crowd, they listen to the same music, they go to the same websites, they like the same influencers, all this stuff is exactly the same. So what we kind of advocate for is, instead of looking at this from a geographic perspective, can we look at this from a cultural perspective, from what matters to them, right? Because if what matters to them is the reason that they're engaged in the risk behavior, then that's the thing we should be paying the most attention to. And so here, if you did have a country campaign, for example, that country campaign would influence teens throughout the country, no matter which community they lived in, and no matter how big that peer crowd was in that community. So those 5 country kids in LA, they would be influenced by that campaign, if it existed. Another piece that we often point to is actually racial distinctions and how that comes into play. And yes, of course, being a different race gives you a different perspective on the world, means you come up differently and all sorts of different things. But an African American teen who is alternative and an African American teen who is hip hop have less in common than an African American hip hop teen and a Hispanic hip hop teen. Because the peer crowd that they've chosen to identify with tells us a lot more about who they are today, who their friends are, what music they listen to, what websites they go to, what events they go to, what clothing they wear, all these things that are super relevant today. While their ethnicity might tell us more about where they came from, what their parents are like, what their neighborhood might be like. And so, a lot of times you say, oh, well, we need an African American campaign or we need a Hispanic campaign. But that's a little bit too simplistic when we're talking about teenagers. Because teenagers, it's more about who they're hanging out with. And that's really how we can figure out what role that behavior is playing. And it goes even beyond that. We talk about, oh well, Hispanics, we have all these Hispanic immigrants. We have to come up with unique strategies for these different Hispanic immigrants and things like that. And I say, not if you look at where they come from. Because where they come from, there's Hispanic pop,
Yeah, pop is all.
there's Hispanic hip hop, and there's Hispanic alternative, and it's just like hip hop, pop, and alternative in the United States. So if that's the culture in the country that they come from, why do we have to treat them any differently here? And so this is, this goes way, way beyond our borders, and it really is an international phenomenon. And let me show you a couple more studies real quick. So this is an African American teen study in Virginia. It was about 600 African American teens conducted this survey online, and we used what we call our eye-based survey, which is the survey that measures peer crowd using the pictures. And we found that there was primarily 3 peer crowds that were popular amongst African American teens. It was preppy, mainstream, and hip hop. And we wanted, because this was quantitative, we wanted to make sure that they were that peer crowd. So if they had kind of scores that were really close in more than one peer crowd, they went into an indeterminate bucket. That just means they're being influenced by more than one peer crowd. We didn't want that to create noise in our data, so we just kind of made them their own group. So what we found when we looked at the 3 more distinct peer crowds is that when we looked at tobacco use, hip-hop teens were significantly more likely to smoke cigarettes, to smoke Black and Milds, or to be dual tobacco users than preppy or mainstream African American teens. But we found even bigger differences when we looked at their perception of their friends. So we asked them, how many of your friends smoke a cigarette or smoke black and mild, and looked at how many answered most or all of my friends, huge differences between the groups. So 24%, 35% of hip hop teens are saying most or all of my friends smoke cigarettes or smoke black and milds, while only 5% and 12% of preppy teens are, 10% and 12% of mid-sec teens are. So the difference when we look at their perception of their world is even bigger than just the difference in behavior. So again, we're seeing that there's one group that needs our approach, needs our messages the most, but is also probably the least likely group for us to target today, because we're looking at, well, what's the biggest group of teens that we could reach with our messages. Kind of going a little deeper into youth violence, we did a study with the district attorney's office in San Diego that involved a few hundred teens from a local high school, a probation high school, and also from juvenile detention centers. We used the eye-based surveys again, and we did this venue experiment that I'll show you in a moment. And what we found in fighting amongst our peer crowds, now remember, this is overall a much higher risk group that we engage, so that's why we have very high percentages, but you still see that difference. So you see that we had 3 different kinds of hip hop, and that's often what happens when you really dive very deeply into a peer crowd. You'll start to see that it splits a little bit, but they're all still influenced by very similar tenets of hip hop culture. That it was Hispanic hip hop culture that was most associated with having engaged in violence in the past year, and alternative culture that was least likely to have engaged in violence. So remember, alternative before was one of the highest risks of tobacco use, but they're at one of the lowest risks for physical violence. So, each behavior is different by peer crowd. It's not just that hip hop's bad or alternative's bad or anything like that. It's just different variables that we're learning about. When we looked at, we did a regression, and we saw that associating with the hip hop peer crowd was more influential than all of the other variables. It was the only significant variable, and here we were looking at race and the other peer crowds, as well as age and gender. And we know that gender has a huge impact on having engaged in violence, but being associated with this peer crowd, really took over that. And we did a fun little experiment that I'll quickly share. We created these fake places where a teen could go after school to participate in a group. And we asked them how likely they were to go to these different places. And so we thought, well, let's think out of the box. Why do we have to have every program at a high school or at a community center? Can't we partner with a stakeholder in these youth lives, rather than just in our world, but in one of their world, which is the places that they're interested in? And you might be able to guess that for the Hispanic hip hop teens, if there was a program at the Lowrider Studio, they would be there every day. And that was their most favorite place for them to go and hang out after school if something existed there. And the least likely place for them to go was the community center, which is usually where we're sending them, right? And then when we looked at African American hip hop teens, we saw a slightly different one. They were open to teen centers, and also to kind of hip hop stores, like clothing store, music store type of that. Weren't really interested in the Lowrider Studio, but also weren't interested in the community center or other places. Interestingly, the church was a very positive place for Hispanic hip hop teens, but not necessarily a place African American teens wanted to go to, African American hip hop teens. So very interesting there. And when we talk to them, we have some awesome quotes from some of these youth that really paints a picture on it. This quote is about changing, and they say, I don't plan on changing. It just sounds good when you're saying it, like you ask, what are you going to do? You can go to school? Yeah, I'll go to school, but I actually won't go to school, I don't even want to go to school. You're going to do what you're going to do. And this is kind of that sense of the conversation that we have with youth in a controlled environment of whether it's the detention center, the probation office, or the school, and they say, oh yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But when they get back to their environment and nothing has changed in their environment, they're going to do what they were always doing. Because to them, it's that environment that's influencing them, not that kind of abnormal environment that they're receiving services in. And another kid really told the story very well, which was, a lot of people think that banging is all about drugs, but it's not. I have homies that bang and don't do drugs. For them, it's more about what other people think of you, the lifestyle, the family. That it's more about that identity that being in a gang provides, and not about getting caught up in the drugs or the violence necessarily. And so again, if we're saying don't do this because you're going to go to jail, we're also implicitly saying I need you to change your identity. I need you to dress differently, talk differently, hang out with different people. I'm not going to give you necessarily any tools to do that, but I need you to do all of those things. And that is a really, really tall order for a kid whose neighborhood might be primarily dominated by this peer crowd or culture that they are currently engaged in. One more variable that we measure that is also very telling is something that we call social concern. And social concern tells us how worried a young person is about being cool, about being socially successful in their own peer crowd. So this is separate from peer crowd, all of them are the same. It doesn't mean they actually are cool. We don't have a cool survey. We don't know how cool they are. But we can measure how worried they are. Do they wake up in the morning and worry about what they're going to wear? Do they, are they conscious of what other people think of them? And so we came up with this survey to measure this, and we've been using this survey for a number of years. And they get a score from about 1 to 16, and it's called their social concern score. And this is a data set from San Diego, a different one from San Diego. And this has to do with smoking. So you can see we just divided the group into 3, the low social concern, medium social concern, and high social concern. And you can see the huge differences. Teens who have high social concern are more likely to engage in tobacco use. We also measured binge drinking, and here you can see another huge difference. If you have high social concern, you're much more likely to have engaged in binge drinking than to have low social concern. And then finally, physical fighting, again, a huge difference. If you have high social concern, you're more likely to have engaged in violence. So now, what we're seeing is not just certain peer crowds are at risk, but we're seeing the youth within those peer crowds who are most worried about their identity, most worried about being cool, most worried about being liked by their friends, most worried about, most insecure about that, are the ones who are most likely engaging in these risk behaviors. And often we are asking the most insecure, the most worried teens, to go against the norms of their peer crowd in order to take whatever message that we're trying to give them. So that's where a lot of our strategies came from. Our idea of social branding came from, is there a way to, instead of asking a teen to abandon their identity, asking an insecure, fragile teen to abandon their identity, is there a way we can change what it means to be hip-hop, change what it means to be alternative, take the good of those cultures, the music, the clothing, though we might not like the clothing, it's not hurting anyone. Take the clothing, the music, the dance, all these really cool things about it. And can we make those what define the culture and make the risk behaviors passé? Just like a clothing brand comes in and out of the culture, just like a musician comes in and out of the culture, can a risk behavior come in and out of the culture just as easily if we position it the right way? And so that's what social branding is. It's the strategy that utilizes certain commercial marketing tactics to change the social image associated with certain behaviors within certain peer crowds. And so here, we see the same cycle that we saw earlier, but what we see is we introduce a social brand. And the social brand has to be more influential than the existing influencers that this teen has in their peer crowd. Now, that sounds hard, but in reality, their influencer is not the most famous rapper. It's another kid at their school or in their neighborhood. That's who's most reachable, it's most relevant to them. And that kid, even if you only have $5,000, that kid doesn't have $5,000. So no matter how small your budget is, it's bigger than the cool teenager's budget to be cool. And so we can create a brand that, that does the right things, that acts the right way, that looks the right way, talks the right way. And once it kind of introduces itself into that peer crowd, it can then introduce new behaviors. Now, the components of the social brand are kind of 3, when we look at it from a psychological, behavioral perspective, there's 3 components that make a social brand. The first one is how the brand fits into the youth's social identity. And so what that is how the brand looks, its image, its voice, its personality. If it does this right, a young person will identify with the brand. And will say, okay, this brand knows where I'm coming from, is like me, I will be aware of it, I will pay attention to it, I will listen to it. The next piece is the personal identity. So how does the brand identify with why the teen is making these decisions, who they are? And to do that, the brand has to engage in similar activities. So whether that's being interested in that kind of music, being interested in competitions that have to do with hip-hop dance, whether for a hip-hop audience, whatever it is, it's things that youth would be interested in doing that the brand does those things too. And what that does is it gives the brand something that we call social authority. It gives it the authority to enter the culture and say something has changed. I'm cooler than you, so I'm allowed to say that we don't smoke anymore. I'm cooler than you, so I'm allowed to say that we don't fight anymore. And you have to establish that kind of level in order to be able to introduce that authority. And then the last piece is the behavior. How do we change the behavior? we have to introduce a new behavior with a utility that is relevant to that peer crowd. So this is where that flipping the perspective comes in. We can't just look at it as, well, why is this behavior important to me? We have to look at the values of that culture and say, why is it important to this group? And so let me show you an example of what that looks like. So this is a generally targeted advertisement for tobacco, and this is kind of the average strategy.
Are people talking about your smoker's breath?
Okay, so that's an average strategy, you know, kind of have like nondescript looking teens, they look preppy, they look mainstream, and it's an issue that we think teens care about, right? So this is where, you know, if I'm a hip hop teen, I look at this and it's not relevant to me. If I'm an alternative teen, not relevant to me. I'm a country teen, definitely not relative to me. So who is it relevant to? It's probably relevant to a mainstream teen who doesn't smoke anyways, who sees the girl in the pigtails and says, oh, I have pigtails too, I like her. And that's pretty much as far as the ad goes, right? So now, let's switch over and say, well, what if we wanted to reach hip hop? Well, we would have to do two things. Our ad would have to embody that culture. It'd have to look authentic. But then we also have to talk about something that matters to that group, all right? And so here's an example of what that would be.
Your little brother, your little sister, they want to be as fresh as you. But if you smoke cigs, you double their chances of smoking. So represent freshness by representing tobacco-free hip-hop with the all-new Fresh Society. Check us out at facebook.com/Fresh Society Life.
So there you see that what they're talking about is family, which is extremely important to hip-hop culture. And they're talking about freshness, and that's a slang word in hip-hop, so it's not just about showering. It's, you know, about how you dress, how you look, how new your style is, and stuff like that. All right, but that's hip-hop. So now let's switch over and let's say, well, what does it look like if we talk to alternative teens? And well, again, we have to talk about something different. Alternative teens don't care about freshness, but they care about other things.
So advertisements make it seem like they love animals, but in reality, they tortured animals. They tested cigarettes on monkeys, rabbits, and dogs. In one study, they strapped beagles down and cut their throats open to permanently install a tube that forced the dogs to smoke cigarettes. This filled their bodies with tar that caused some of the dogs to develop cancer. Thousands of beagles, rabbits, and other animals died in experiments just like this one. They used these experiments to make cigarettes even more addictive so that we would get hooked younger and harder. So you want to know why we support a smoke-free scene? Because we're not okay with animal cruelty to make tobacco products more addictive. For more on big tobacco and animal cruelty, check out the Blacklisters on Facebook and leave a comment.
All right, so that is the alternative style. And then finally, so here we're seeing that they're talking about anti-industry, activism, being rebellious, very alternative values. We're not talking about freshness because it doesn't matter to them, right? Yes, those skaters especially. So now, well, what do we talk about to country teens? Neither of those, we can't talk about animal cruelty, they work on farms, right? And we can't talk about freshness, you know, they're dirty and they're out, you know, mudding and going to rodeos. So what can we talk about? Well, there's only one thing that we talk about with country, and that is freedom.
Pickup truck.
This is our playground. These are our toys.
Yes.
We ride wild. We ride free. Sledding fast on open trails, mudding backwood riverbeds, or conquering new forests. Out here, our rides are worked hard. In turn, we work hard for our rides. We save up to gear up, paying for the next part that could take us further and faster. Living fast don't come free. A choice is made to live in freedom. Freedom from tobacco, free from the half pack a day or a few tins of chew a week that can cost about $1,300 a year. Free to spend that grand to take you a long way. Free to buy a new perspective. free to get traction and pull, or just the freedom to get the day before it's gone. Go far, ride hard, live tobacco free. Learn more at facebook.com/downanddirtylife.
All right, so now a completely different approach, right? Now we're talking about freedom. We said it about 20 times. You need about 25 to cause change in the country. But what that shows is it's peer crowds are not just about what it looks like. Peer crowds are about values, different things they care about, different things they talk about, different things that are relevant to their lives. And without knowing this information, what we end up with is a very generalized, bland message, not because it's intentional, but actually because of the entire process. Imagine, what happens if you take this ad and you have a focus group with it, and you don't know who the teens are? You have 2 hip-hop teens in there, a couple alternative teens, a couple preppy teens, a couple mainstream teens. That poor facilitator, what are they going to walk away with other than the most center-of-the-road recommendations of how to please that entire group of teens that you just tried to test that message with, right? And so this is why peer crowds tell us so much about why people are engaging in risk behaviors and how to actually change them. And we're out of time here, so I'm going to skip very quickly to show you. Here's an example of an alternative rock program that is currently active in Virginia. It participates in rock events there and has what we call experiential marketing at the events, a robust social media campaign, paid media. That blacklist ad is similar to the psych ads that they post online. And so you can see here some of the different bands wearing the brand's t-shirts, youth wearing the brand's items. You can see these youth are very alternative. And we'll skip over the video here to jump over to these outcomes. And so what we see is that over a couple years, all of the kind of exposure measures, whether it's awareness, even though we don't need awareness necessarily, but we still measure it just in case. Awareness of being to an event, being to the psych website, were all higher amongst teens who were, that it all grew over time and were higher amongst alternative teens. And we saw a significant reduction in overall tobacco use amongst teens who go to rock shows, but that reduction was concentrated amongst alternative teens. So exactly the kinds of teens that we were looking at. And from a study that was just published in AJPH, which is Commune, which is our young adult tobacco prevention strategy in San Diego, we saw a similar strategy. This strategy was targeting hipsters. So young adults also have their own peer crowds, and hipsters is one of them. And this had events at local bars and clubs. It actually worked with local artists to make different messages every month that are from the local community's perspective. So established artists were the ones that were working on a lot of the messages and posters and things like that, as well as local fashion designers. And I could talk about Commune for hours here. But the important part, we'll skip right to the evaluation here. It also had bar-based cessation groups, which helped get some of these young adults that would never call the quit line in cessation and actually actively quitting. And what we saw was that, over the 4 years that this evaluation has been going, we've seen significant reductions in tobacco use amongst young adults in San Diego that go to bars and clubs, but that reduction was concentrated. So the blue line is the overall reduction, the red line is the non-hipsters, but the green line was the hipsters. So you can see that that reduction was concentrated amongst hipsters, and that white line was our high social concern hipsters. A small group, but a very important group that we wanted to pay the most attention to, because if they're changing, that means other people are changing too. And there's an article about this that just came out in AJPH. And so in closing, what are the key tenets of behavior changes? That peer crowd segmentation, particularly for youth, is critical. It's critical. If we don't know which peer crowds are engaging in the behaviors that we're trying to change, then we don't know why they're engaging in the behaviors. We don't know what to address. We don't know how to address it. Local influencers are, once we know the peer crowd, then local influencers become important. Then we start to work with rock fans, as you saw with Psych, or with different hip hop things that are going on, if that's the crowd that you're targeting. And that going to some of these venues where these youth congregate, that becomes much easier once you're targeting a peer crowd, right? Because now we know where to find them. Because those kinds of youth might hang out at a rock show at a skate park, or they might hang out at the mud bog. Depending on which peer crowd you're looking at, they're going to be at a different location. And that authentic messaging that aligns with their values is what ends up causing that change, because now you're giving them something worth thinking about, instead of a reason that maybe isn't even relevant to their life or their social groups. And this all comes from a respect for the behavior that we're trying to change, right? So instead of approaching it from, this is a bad behavior and let me tell you why it's bad, we approach it from, okay, why is it good for you? Why did you choose to engage in this behavior in the first place? And what you'll find is it often has to do with fitting in, with feeling like they, are friends with the group that they want to be in, that they are cool, that they are, that they have a meaningful relationship with their peers. And if we can find a way to navigate that, then we're going to deliver much more relevant messaging. And so with that, I will open it up to questions. Thank you very much.